It is improper for the President of the United States to demand a foreign government investigate a U.S. citizen.
Would you call yourself a never-Trumper?
I'd call myself never partisan.
Well, you never leaked information?
I never did, never would. That is preposterous that I would do that.
At no time was I aware of or knowingly took part in an effort to urge Ukraine to investigate former Vice President Biden.
It really only comes down to what did the President of the United States intend and what did the Ukrainians understand or hear?
I have had the privilege of working as a Foreign Service officer for nearly 14 years, working for 3 different presidential administrations, 2 Republican and 1 Democratic. I found the July 25th phone call unusual because, in contrast to other presidential calls I had observed, it involved discussion of what appeared to be a domestic political matter.
I was concerned by the call. What I heard was inappropriate, and I reported my concerns to Mr. Eisenberg. It is improper for the President of the United States to demand a foreign government investigate a U.S. citizen and a political opponent. When I reported my concerns, my only thought was to act properly and to carry out my duty. I am humbled to come before you today as one of many who serve in the most distinguished and able military in the world. The Army is the only profession I've ever known. As a young man, I decided I wanted to spend my life serving this nation and gave my family refuge from authoritarian oppression. I also recognize that my simple act of appearing here today, just like the courage of my colleagues who have also truthfully testified before this committee, would not be tolerated in many places around the world. Dad, I'm sitting here today in the U.S. Capitol talking to our elected professionals is proof that you made the right decision 40 years ago to leave the Soviet Union and come here to the United States of America in search of a better life for our family. Do not worry. I will be fine for telling the truth.
And Colonel Vindman, you attended a meeting in John Bolton's office on July 10th where Ambassador Sondland interjected to respond to a question by senior Ukrainian officials about a White House visit. What did he say at that time?
To the best of my recollection, Ambassador Sondland said that in order to get a White House meeting, the Ukrainians would have to provide a deliverable, which is investigations, specific investigations.
And what was Ambassador Bolton's response or reaction to that comment?
We had not completed all of the agenda items, and we still had time for the meeting, and Ambassador Bolton abruptly ended the meeting.
About 2 weeks after that July 10th meeting, President Trump and President Zelensky had their second call, the now infamous July 25th call. Colonel Vindman, what was your real-time reaction to hearing that call?
Without hesitation, I knew that I had to report this to the White House counsel. I had concerns, and it was my duty to report my concerns to the proper people in the chain of command.
You've described this as a demand, this favor that the President asked. What is it about the relationship between the President of the United States and the President of Ukraine that leads you to conclude that when the President of the United States asks a favor like this, it's really a demand?
Chairman, the culture I come from, the military culture, when a senior asks you to do something, even if it's polite and pleasant, it's not to be taken as a request. It's to be taken as an order. In this case, the power disparity between the 2 leaders, my impression is that in order to get the White House meeting, President Zelensky would have to deliver these investigations.
Did you discuss the July 25th phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky or any matters associated with the phone call with any members of the press?
No.
Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, did you discuss the July 25th phone call with anyone outside the White House on July 25th or the 26th? And if so, with whom?
Yes, I did. My core function is to coordinate U.S. government policy, interagency policy, and I spoke to 2 individuals with regards to providing some sort of readout of the call.
2 individuals that were not in the White House?
Not in the White House, cleared U.S. government officials with appropriate need to know.
And what agencies were these officials with?
Department of State, Deputy Assistant Secretary George Kent, and an individual from the Office of an individual in the intelligence community.
As you know, the intelligence community has 17 different agencies. What agency was this individual from?
If I could interject here, we don't want to use these proceedings.
It's our time,
I know,
Mr. Chair.
but we need to protect the whistleblower.
Please stop.
I want to make sure that there's no effort to out the whistleblower through the use of these proceedings. If the witness has a good faith belief that this may reveal the identity of the whistleblower, that is not the purpose that we are here for, and I want to advise the witness accordingly.
Mr. Vindman, you testified in your deposition that you did not know the whistleblower.
Ranking member, it's Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, please.
Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, you testified in the deposition that you did not know who the whistleblower was or is.
I do not know who the whistleblower is. That is
So how is it possible for you to name these people and then out the whistleblower?
Per the advice of my counsel, I've been advised not to answer specific questions about members of the intelligence community.
You went to Ukraine for the inauguration?
Correct.
May 20th. At any point during that trip, did Mr. Daniluk offer you a position of defense minister with the Ukrainian government?
He did.
And how many times did he do that?
I believe it was 3 times.
And do you have any reason why he asked you to do that?
I don't know, but every single time I dismissed it. Upon returning, I notified my chain of command and the appropriate counterintelligence folks about the offer.
I mean, that was a big honor, correct?
I'm an American. I came here when I was a toddler, and I immediately dismissed these offers, did not entertain them.
Mr. Morrison said this: I had concerns about Lieutenant Colonel Vindman's judgment. Among the discussions I had with Dr. Hill in the transition was our team, its strength, its weaknesses, and Fiona and others had raised concerns about Alex's judgment. When Mr. Morris was asked by Mr. Castor, did anyone ever bring concerns to you that they believe Colonel Vindman may have leaked something, Mr. Morrison replied, yes. So your boss had concerns about your judgment. Your former boss, Dr. Hill, had concerns about your judgment. Your colleagues had concerns about your judgment, and your colleagues felt that there were times when you leaked information. Any idea why they have those impressions, Colonel Vindman?
Yes, Representative Jordan, I guess I'll start by reading Dr. Hill's own words, as she attested to in my last evaluation that was dated middle of July, right before she left. Alex is a top 1% military officer and the best Army officer I have worked with in my 15 years of government service. He is brilliant, unflappable, and exercises excellent judgment. So, Mr. Jordan, I would say that I can't say what why Mr. Morrison questioned my judgment. We had only recently started working together. He wasn't there very long, and we were just trying to figure out our relationship. Maybe it was a different cultures, military culture versus.
And Colonel, you never leaked information?
I never did, never would. That is preposterous that I would do that.
Okay.
Ms. Williams, on Sunday, the president personally targeted you in a tweet. This is after he targeted Ambassador Yovanovitch during her hearing testimony. I'd like to show and read you the tweet. It reads, "Tell Jennifer Williams, whoever that is, to read both transcripts of the presidential calls and see the just-released statement from Ukraine. Then she should meet with the other never-Trumpers, who I don't know and mostly never even heard of, and work out a better presidential attack." Ms. Williams, are you engaged in a presidential attack?
No, sir.
Ms. Williams, are you a never-Trumper?
I'm not sure I know an official definition of a never-Trumper.
Would you describe yourself that way?
I would not, no.
Did that tweet make an impression on you when you read it?
It certainly surprised me. I was not expecting to be called out by name.
The day after you appeared for your deposition, Lieutenant Colonel, President Trump called you a never-Trumper. Colonel Vindman, would you call yourself a never-Trumper?
Representative, I'd call myself never partisan.
Colonel Vindman, multiple right-wing conspiracy theorists, including Rudy Giuliani, have accused you of harboring loyalty towards Ukraine. They make these accusations based only on the fact that your family, like many American families, immigrated to the United States. They've accused you of espionage and dual loyalties. We've seen that in this room this morning. The 3 minutes that were spent asking you about the offer made to make you the Minister of Defense, that may have come cloaked in a Brooks Brothers suit and in parliamentary language, but that was designed exclusively to give the right-wing media an opening to question your loyalties. And I want people to understand what that was all about.
Much has been talked about, as we've discussed, between the President Trump and President Zelensky and the word favor, and this being interpreted as a basis for impeachment. And your interpretation of the word favor, and I'll paraphrase you, and you feel free to correct me, you said, in the military culture, which you and I are both familiar with, when a superior officer asks for a favor of a subordinate, they will interpret that as a demand. Is that a fair synopsis of what you previously stated?
Representative, when a superior makes a request, that's an order.
Okay. Is President Trump a member of the military?
He is not.
Has he ever served in the military?
Not that I'm aware of.
Is President Zelensky a member of the military?
I don't believe so. I don't know.
He's not. Would it be fair then to take a person who has never served in the military and to take your reevaluation of their words based on your military experience and your military culture and to attach that culture and that meaning of those words to someone who has never served?
Representative, I made that judgment. I stick by that judgment.
Okay, well, I got to tell you, I think it's nonsense.
When you came forward out of sense of duty, that you were putting yourself in direct opposition to the most powerful person in the world. Do you realize that, sir?
I knew I was assuming a lot of risk.
And I'm struck by that word, don't worry, that phrase, do not worry, you addressed to your dad. Was your dad a warrior?
He did serve. It was a different military, though.
And he would have worried if you were putting yourself up against the President of the United States, is that right?
He deeply worried about it because in his context, there was the ultimate risk.
And why do you have confidence that you can do that and tell your dad not to worry?
Congressman, because this is America. This is the country I've served and defended, that all of my brothers have served, and here, right matters.
Thank you, sir. Yield back.
I appear before you today under subpoena to answer your questions about my time as Senior Director for European Affairs at the White House and the National Security Council. My recollections and judgments are my own. Some of my colleagues' recollections of conversations and interactions may differ from mine, but I do not view those differences as the result of an untoward purpose. I feared at the time of the call on July 25th how its disclosure would play in Washington's political climate. My fears have been realized.
For over 2 years, as U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations, my singular focus was advancing the foreign policy and national security interests of the United States. At no time was I aware of or knowingly took part in an effort to urge Ukraine to investigate former Vice President Biden. As you know from the extensive real-time documentation I have provided, Vice President Biden was not a topic of our discussions. I was not on the July 25th phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky. I was not made aware of any reference to Vice President Biden or his son by President Trump until the transcript of that call was released on September 25th, 2019. I learned in May 2019 that we had a significant problem that was impeding our ability to strengthen our support for Ukraine's new president in his effort to ramp up Ukraine's fight against corruption and implementation of needed reforms. I found myself faced with a choice: to be aware of a problem and to ignore it, or to accept that it was my responsibility to try to fix it. I tried to fix it. The problem was that despite the unanimous positive assessment and recommendations of those of us who were part of the U.S. presidential delegation that attended the inauguration of President Zelensky, President Trump was receiving a different negative narrative about Ukraine and President Zelensky. That narrative was fueled by accusations from Ukraine's then Prosecutor General and conveyed to the President by former Mayor Rudy Giuliani. As I previously told this committee, I became aware of the negative impact this was having on our policy efforts when 4 of us, who were part of the presidential delegation to the inauguration, met as a group with President Trump on May 23rd. We stressed our finding that President Zelensky represented the best chance for getting Ukraine out of the mire of corruption it had been in for over 20 years. We urged him to invite President Zelensky to the White House. The president was very skeptical. Given Ukraine's history of corruption, that's understandable. He said that Ukraine was a corrupt country full of terrible people. He said, they tried to take me down. Ukrainians believe that if they could get their own narrative across in a way that convinced Mayor Giuliani that they were serious about fighting corruption and advancing reform, Mayor Giuliani would convey that assessment to President Trump, thus correcting the previous negative narrative. That made sense to me, and I tried to be helpful. Mr. Giuliani said he believed the Ukrainian president needed to make a statement about fighting corruption and that he had discussed this with Mr. Yermak. I said I did not think that this would be a problem since that is the government's position anyway. I followed up with Mr. Yermak, and he said that they would indeed be prepared to make a statement. He said it would reference Burisma and 2016 in a wider context of bilateral relations and rooting out corruption anyway. There was no mention of Vice President Biden. Throughout this time, I understood that there was an important distinction between Burisma and Biden. I urged the Ukrainians to maintain such a distinction. I did not know that President Trump or others had raised Vice President Biden with the Ukrainians, or had conflated the investigation of possible Ukrainian corruption with investigation of the former vice president. In retrospect, for the Ukrainians, it would clearly have been confusing. In hindsight, I now understand that others saw the idea of investigating possible corruption involving the Ukrainian company Burisma as equivalent to investigating former Vice President Biden. I saw them as very different, the former being appropriate and unremarkable, the latter being unacceptable. In retrospect, I should have seen that connection differently, and had I done so, I would have raised my own objections.
What is it now, Ambassador, in retrospect, that you recognize that you didn't at this time, that leads you to conclude that you would or should have raised these objections?
Yeah. That others did not see the distinction between these things as I saw it. As I said, there is a history of corruption in Ukraine. There's a history with the company of Burisma that's been investigated. That is well known. There is a separate allegation about the vice president acting inappropriately. His son was a board member of this company, but those things I saw as completely distinct. And what I was trying to do in working with the Ukrainians was to thread a needle, to see whether things that they can do that are appropriate and reasonable as part of Ukraine's own policy of fighting corruption, that help clarify for our president that they are committed to that very effort. If there's a way to thread that needle, I thought it was worth the effort to try to solve that problem. As it turns out, I now understand that most of the other people didn't see or didn't consider this distinction, that for them it was synonymous.
I take it you didn't know until the call record was released that the president in that call doesn't raise Burisma. He asked for an investigation of the Bidens. Is that right?
That is correct.
I take it, since you say that you acknowledge that asking for an investigation of the Bidens would have been unacceptable and objectionable, that had the president asked you to get Ukraine to investigate the Bidens, you would have told him so.
I would have objected to that, yes, sir.
When you say thread the needle, you mean that you understood the relationship between Vice President Biden's son and Burisma, but you were trying to separate the two of them in your mind? Is that right?
Well, I believe that they were separate. This references the conversation I had with Mr. Giuliani as well, where I think the allegations against Vice President Biden are self-serving and not credible. Separate question is whether it is appropriate for Ukraine to investigate possible corruption of Ukrainians that may have tried to corrupt things or buy influence. To me, they are very different things. And as I said, I think the former is unacceptable. I think the latter, in this case, is...
Understood, but you understood the relationship between Hunter Biden and Burisma.
I knew that he had been a board member of the company, yes.
You described the president's skepticism at your deposition as a reasonable position?
Yes.
And I believe you said most people who know anything about Ukraine would possibly think that.
Yes.
and you viewed it as part of your role to help change his mind, that President Zelensky was a genuine reformer, that he was not running for office for self-enrichment, that he was indeed a good person.
That's correct.
You testified in your deposition to the extent the Ukrainians were going to investigate other Ukrainians for wrongdoing, that was perfectly appropriate in your mind?
Correct. That has been U.S. policy for years.
So if certain Ukrainians involved with the Burisma company,
that I think is the only plausible thing to look at there. As I said, I don't find it plausible or credible that Vice President Biden would have been influenced in his duties, but whether individual Ukrainians in the society that we know Ukraine has been for decades were trying to act in a corrupt way or to buy influence, that's plausible.
right. You indicated in your deposition that when you took over the portfolio for Dr. Hill, July 15th, you were alerted to potential issues in Colonel Vindman's judgment?
Yes.
Did she relay anything specifically to you? Why she thought that?
Not as such. It was more of a overarching statement from her and her deputy, who became my deputy, that they had concerns about judgment.
Okay. Before my time expires, Ambassador Volker, I want to turn quickly to the what Ambassador Taylor describes as the irregular channel. You're an experienced diplomat. At one point in time, Senate confirmed. Ambassador Sondland is the ambassador to the European Union. Secretary Perry is a Secretary of Energy. Certainly not, it doesn't sound like an irregular bunch. Did he ever articulate to you that he thought the three of you working on Ukraine policy was a problem?
No, he did not.
And were you surprised during his testimony when he came in for the deposition, when he sort of established these two tracks, that one was a regular channel that he was in charge of and the other was a
Yes,
irregular
I don't agree with his characterization of that, because I had been in my role for a couple of years. I have been the lead on U.S.-Ukraine negotiations and negotiating with Russia and the interagency work and the work with our allies. And we have a Secretary of Energy who is a cabinet official. And I think having support from various U.S. officials for our strengthening our engagement with Ukraine, I view it as a very positive thing. And if the concern is not us so much then, because we're all U.S. officials, but Mayor Giuliani, I don't view that as a channel at all, because he's not a representative of the U.S. government. He's a private citizen. I viewed him as perhaps a useful barometer in understanding what may be helpful communication from the Ukrainian government, but not someone in a position to represent the U.S. government at all.
Are you aware that Ambassador Taylor, who testified based on quite detailed notes, indicated that earlier, a few days before that, Ambassador Sondland had told him that President Trump is a businessman, and so before he writes a check, he likes to see people pay up, something to that effect. You're aware of that?
I am familiar with that testimony.
And you're also familiar that Ambassador Taylor said that you said something very similar to him when you were in Ukraine for the Yes Conference. Do you recall saying that to Ambassador Taylor?
Yes, I do. I was repeating what Gordon Sondland had said to me to explain to Bill Taylor what that understanding was.
And in what context did Ambassador Sondland say that to you?
I think we were talking about the release of the hold on security assistance.
Right.
And he was saying that the president he's already, got a negative view of Ukraine. He sees a check on his desk that's going to the Ukrainians, not sure about them, so he wants to hold on to it until he's assured.
Right, and the pay up before he writes the check is to get the investigations that he wants, isn't that right?
That was not clear to me.
What did you think it meant?
I didn't think that there was a pay-up. As we said, the language was similar. I had heard from Gordon that he sees this check. He's not sure he wants it. He wants to make sure that he's got to deal with the Ukrainians. I didn't know specifically, other than the generic formulation.
Mr. Morrison, Mr. Volker thinks it's inappropriate to ask a foreign head of state to investigate a U.S. person, let alone a political rival, but you've said you had no concern with that. Do you think that's appropriate?
As a hypothetical matter, I do not.
Well, I'm not talking about a hypothetical matter. Read the transcript. In that transcript, does the president not ask Zelensky to look into the Bidens?
Mr. Chairman, I can only tell you what I was thinking at the time. That is not what I understood the president to be doing.
A lot of people talking about their perceptions, their beliefs, their feelings even, what they heard and their understandings and their thoughts. Ambassador Taylor, Mr. Kent, Ambassador Yovanovitch, and Lieutenant Colonel Vindman all had conversations with each other and with other people and all had a whole bunch of hearsay. But I can assure you this boils down to just one thing. This is an impeachment inquiry concerning the President of the United States. So the only thing that matters, besides all these people talking to each other and all their feelings and all of their thoughts and understandings, it really only comes down to what did the President of the United States intend, and what did he say, and what did the Ukrainians understand or hear? Ambassador Volker, you're one of the first people that we've had in these open public testimony that's had conversations with both. So I get to ask you. You had a meeting with the President of the United States, and you believe that the policy issues that he raised concerning Ukraine were valid, correct?
Yes.
Did the President of the United States ever say to you that he was not going to allow aid for the United States to go to the Ukraine unless there were investigations into Burisma, the Bidens, or the 2016 elections?
No, he did not.
Did the Ukrainians ever tell you that they understood that they would not get a meeting with the President of the United States, a phone call with the President of the United States, military aid, or foreign aid from the United States unless they undertook investigations of Burisma, the Bidens, or the 2016 elections?
No, they did not.
You know, pretty much, Ambassador Volker, you just took apart their entire case. I mean, if the President of the United States does not believe or intend it, and the Ukrainians don't understand it, and you're the only one who actually stands in between them. Mr. Morrison, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman reported to you, is that correct?
He did, sir.
Now, you have a legal background. He said that he listened to the phone call which you said you saw nothing that had occurred illegally. And he said that he believed the President of the United States demanded to President Zelensky that these investigations move forward. Do you believe, because he only was telling us his opinion, do you believe in your opinion that the President of the United States demanded that President Zelensky undertake these investigations?
No, sir.